welcome to our 8th week guest speaker. My name is Mike Yaley. I'm the director at the Lair, the Bear. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. A reminder that we are recording this Zoom tonight, so if you don't want to be on the recording, please just stop your video. Also, please keep yourself on mute just to keep the noise down. And finally, if you have questions, please put them in the chat throughout the presentation. And our speaker, Kathleen, will address them either in real time or at the end, depending on the question. And I think that's it from that. And so first I'll talk about our topic tonight. And while the American president has served as the country's most visible public official for more than 2 centuries, throughout history, the president's silence has often reverberated more than his direct support for civil rights movements. Join us for a historical overview of presidential action and inaction to help provide context to the civil rights protests and activism of recent months. And to talk about that tonight is Kathleen Gronnerud. She is an adjunct professor of American history at Saddleback College, author of the upcoming book, Hillary Clinton, A Life in America. And in 2018, she was the co-editor of Modern American Political Dynasties, a study of family power and political influence. She's a graduate of UC Berkeley, Northwestern, and CSU Fullerton. And Kathleen holds master's degrees in both history and journalism with early training as a radio and television reporter. And without further ado, please welcome Kathleen Gronnerud.
Hi guys, so many friendly faces. This is so fun. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen, and I won't share the screen the whole time, but I want you guys to be able to see a few slides so that we can, everybody can follow along. So let's go here first. Okay. So first of all, I just want to make it clear that I am not a fortune teller. I am not a paid political commentator. I'm not a political scientist, so I don't necessarily study why political actions happen the way they happen. I am a historian. So what I was hoping to do tonight is give a little bit of history as context to what we're going through right now. Because I know for myself, when I started reading a lot of the news over the last couple months and watching my social media feeds, I myself wanted to dive into, well, should the president be acting? What's the precedent for him to be acting? And of course, some cases came to my own mind, but I kind of did some research, and so that's what I wanted to share with you tonight, and then we can open it up to questions. There's no way I'm going to talk for more than 30 minutes. So I wanted to start with a quote. I always like to start with a quote. I do this in my classes all the time. So I want you to just think about this for a second, that history is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And we can thank the author James Baldwin back in 1965 for that insight. And so again, just the idea, like I tell my students in classes all the time, that history does not repeat itself, but it often looks very familiar. And so oftentimes looking at what has happened in the past can help give us ideas about, maybe what we could expect out of the future or expect currently. And it also gives us context to kind of think about, are things as great as we think they are or as horrible as we think they are at any present moment? So I also wanted to start off with a definition, because I think it's important to make sure that everybody who's part of a discussion like this is on the same page. So for some of you, this may be very obvious. For others of you, this might be a good kind of reminder. But when we talk about civil rights, what do we mean exactly? So the Britannica definition of civil rights is these are guarantees of equal social opportunities and equal protection under the law, regardless of race, religion, or any other personal characteristic. So a couple of examples. Some that probably come to, right to the front of mind are the right to vote. the right to a fair trial, right to government services, right to a public education, and the right to use public facilities. And we'll talk more about a number of these. I think it's also important to note two other points that I put up here. And that is that in contrast to our civil liberties, which we also hear a lot about, right? Civil liberties are those that are secured when we limit what the government can do, right? So in many ways, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, generally known as the Bill of Rights, right, were put in place to guarantee civil liberties. They named things that the government could not do, right, to make sure that the people got to keep liberties that it was assumed they had. And then there's the idea of natural rights, right? These are human rights, often called that too, in which people get these rights inherently, just by being a human. You have some of these rights, and they might come from God, they might come from nature, but civil rights are things that must be given to us and guaranteed for us by a government, by the power of a state. So they're a little bit different than these other two kind of classes of rights when we think about them. So when I was doing my own research and kind of looking at, well, you know, when have presidents really stepped in and made significant moves in terms of civil rights, what I would consider showing great leadership? One quote that I put in some of my lectures came right to mind, and this is actually from the former slave, escaped slave, and famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And he once wrote that power concedes nothing without a demand. And I think this very much speaks to how presidents have interacted with kind of the push for civil rights in the past. And almost always, the beginning of civil rights movements, the beginning of progress, as many people would say it, starts at the grassroots. It starts with the people, down at the bottom. It doesn't start from the top, where one individual like the president or an important senator says, oh, we should do this. Instead, it starts from the bottom. So whether this be the abolition of slavery from, you know, the time of the founding of our country or even before, whether that be the rights, expanded rights for women, recognition under the law, protection under the law, and of course the right to vote, which really started in the mid-1800s, although you could also trace that to the founding if you looked at the letters of Abigail Adams and John Adams. It started with grassroots advocacy is really responsible for gay and lesbian rights today, most notably really picking up steam after the late 1960s with the Stonewall demonstrations, sometimes called riots. I think I'd rather call them rebellions or demonstrations. And so what happens is that these grassroots efforts get big enough, they get noisy enough, right, that then there's some kind of critical flashpoint, as I'm calling it, that helps these grassroots movements that have been trying to get attention for what they want changed for, in some cases, decades after decades. Some event happens that all of a sudden people in the general populace here in America go, oh my gosh, did you know that was happening? So, example, 1919, you get the women suffragettes start handcuffing themselves to the gate in front of the White House. And this immediately gets coverage, gets photographs in the Washington newspapers. And they get arrested. And the officials in Washington, D.C. don't know where to put the women because they don't want to put them in the regular jails with all the men. They literally have to make a women's jail for somewhere to put these women, these socialites. But this drew attention and it became an embarrassment to the president, to Woodrow Wilson. Here he is trying to push the United States into a war in the name of fighting for democracy. And he's got, his own citizens, getting arrested in front of the White House saying, 50% of the population here in America isn't allowed to participate in the democracy by having the ability to vote. So that was, that got the public attention focused on what these women had been pushing for almost a century. Another flashpoint, of course, would be Selma, right? A lot of you probably have just more recently learned more about the events at Selma in the 1960s because of the passing of John Lewis, who was one of the organizers of that march. And when the police there in Selma beat the protesters, turned tear gas them, turned fire hoses on them, police dogs, it was all caught by newspaper photographers and then more and more by television cameras. And that really changed and woke up, to a certain extent, the public. And we've seen that again more frequently. We saw it just this year, right, with George Floyd and the video that was captured on a cell phone and that millions upon millions of people have now watched. So when one of these critical flashpoints happens and we have more of the population than just our grassroots advocates all of a sudden saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's happening. I didn't know that was happening, or I didn't know it was happening to that extent, or I didn't know it was that awful. That creates a question for the president. For other people in power too, but I mostly study the presidency, so I'm focusing on the president, right? And it becomes a question of, am I gonna act based on my conscience, based on what I believe is politically correct, or am I not? And if I'm not going to act, is that also based on conscience? I don't think I should. Or politics, I think that it would be harmful to me or harmful to the country if I act. And I believe that the best presidents, the ones who really have moved us forward in terms of civil rights, have been the ones at these flashpoint moments who have said, my conscience tells me I need to lead on this. I need to morally and politically lead. And they have taken that opportunity for leadership. Now, that's not to say that there aren't many presidents who have taken small steps over time, where they kind of pushed the bounds of popular thinking at their time, or of at least the consensus in Washington. But I think that there are, unfortunately, a few cases that really stand out in terms of presidential leadership. And some of these might be very obvious, and you might be like, oh, I already know about that. But for those of you who haven't really thought about history or read much about it, since you took a history class in college, a few that I would point out that I think really showed exceptional leadership, Abraham Lincoln being one, by really pushing for the 13th Amendment. So of course, Abraham Lincoln is famous for the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War, which is where he said that as commander-in-chief during a time of war, I have the right to free the slaves in those areas in rebellion. That's how he always referred to the southern states. He never acknowledged the new confederacy, the new country that the South claimed to have established. He always just said they are the states in a state of rebellion. And he said that in order to help win the war, in order to put down that rebellion, I have the right to free the slaves that are helping them fight. But freeing the slaves during a time of war and only in those areas of rebellion didn't free everybody permanently, because you had 5 border states that all still allowed slavery, but were fighting on the Union side. And so the Emancipation Proclamation did not even free all of the slaves at the time that he enacted it. So he really pushed for the 13th Amendment to be ratified before the war ended, because it was the 13th Amendment that forever abolished slavery and made it illegal in the United States. And that was a bold move. And he had to work really hard to get the 13th Amendment passed. The next one I think that showed great presidential leadership is Ulysses S. Grant. And many people think that Grant was a lousy president and his presidency was full of corruption. And that was the view for about 30 years after he was president. But there's some great new scholarship on him. And Grant really pushed for the 15th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment had freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment had given them citizenship, the idea of birthright citizenship, that if you were born here, doesn't matter who your parents were, Doesn't matter if they were citizens, you are a citizen now. So that was really important, right? Because that was supposed to give them equal protection under the law as citizens. But right away, a lot of the southern states had tried to start passing local state laws to keep the newly freed slaves from voting. And the 15th Amendment was Grant's real push to make sure that the newly freed slaves would be enfranchised, that they would be able to vote, because he knew that in many counties in the South, they outnumbered the white men, who in many cases had been their previous masters, and that the way for them to really ensure their own success in the future and their legal standing would be for them to have the vote. And so he really pushed for that and helped make sure that it passed. He also probably did more to try and help Native Americans than almost any president before him. Unfortunately, most of his efforts ended up being for not much. But right, even during the Civil War, that's really when we had Western expansion taking over the majority of Native American lands in the West in a very, very violent way. Like, violence was the way that this was happening. And many people in the United States government, including General Tecumseh Sherman, who was one of Grant's right-hand men during the war, who was still a general out in the West with the army, they were talking about the only way to deal with the natives in the West is to just annihilate them, to kill them all. And Grant thought that that was just abhorrent. And so he made a speech in front of Congress, and he really pushed for what today does not seem like fair treatment, but he really pushed for the creation of reservations, individual reservations for the individual tribes, rather than trying to put them all on land, say in Oklahoma, and giving them sovereignty on that land. Now, today, we know that giving them reservations took away their native lands, and in many cases, they didn't get reservations anywhere near the lands or in the same climate or with the same type of topography that they were used to for thousands of years. But this still was a really big move at the time to try and give them land and give them protection on that land. He also named a gentleman of Native American descent to be his Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And he really tried to get rid of the corruption within the federal government in its dealings with the Native Americans by going to a lot of the religious groups that traditionally had very good relations with Native tribes, including, for instance, the Quakers, and asking them for recommendations on who should we appoint, right, or try and get to work within Indian affairs, who will treat the natives truly as equals and not try and take advantage of them. The next one I would highlight would be Theodore Roosevelt. A lot of people, they think I'm going to talk, when you talk about civil rights and Theodore Roosevelt, about the fact that he invited Booker T. Washington, right, first black man to dine at the White House. But not much really came at that meeting. Roosevelt didn't really push his Republican or the United States in general into race relations, but he was really a forerunner in terms of women's suffrage. Back when even before he was in politics, when he was a senior at Harvard, he wrote a senior thesis about the fact that women should be given the right to vote. And he even said in that thesis that women should not change their names when they get married, that's just an outdated practice that doesn't make any sense in the 20th century and the coming of the 20th century. And even as he moved up through government, when he was in the New York state government, when he was New York police commissioner, and then, of course, when he was president, he really pushed for the women's right to vote, women's protection under the law. Things like the fact that men who beat their wives should be tried in criminal court, and that should be a punishable crime, meaning incarceration for those men. He also, when he decided not to run for a third term as a Republican because the precedent had been set by George Washington and nobody had run for 3 terms. So he wasn't going to break precedent, but he became so upset at the way that his Republican predecessor, William Howard Taft, handled things that Roosevelt actually decided to form a third party in 1912. And he ran as the candidate for the Bull Moose Party, the party that he created. He allowed women full participation in that political party. And you'll note I'm talking 1912. This is before women are given the national right to vote. And so he allowed them full participation in the party. He made women's suffrage one of the planks of the Bull Moose Party platform. And at the Bull Moose convention, where he was nominated as their candidate for president, that nomination was seconded at the convention by Jane Addams, a very famous progressive social reformer, most notably associated with the Hull House, Settlement House, trying to help immigrants in Chicago. But so he was really on the forefront of pushing for the women's vote and rights. And then I would point to Harry Truman, because there had been other Democrats before him, most notably the president right before him, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had talked about racial equality. But Harry S. Truman really stepped in and did something. He pushed for desegregation of the military. He absolutely hated the idea that Black World War II veterans were coming home and being discriminated against in terms of housing and education under the GI Bill. They were being lynched in the South. And so seeing that he couldn't get Congress because of a lot of the control that Southern Democrats had in Congress to do much on this, he took action into his own hands and did what he could through executive orders. He desegregated the armed forces through executive order. He put in front of Congress probably the most far-reaching set of civil rights proposals that any president had to that point, including support for an anti-lynching bill. And we don't really think of him because those bills didn't get passed, but that doesn't mean that he didn't show leadership in stepping up and saying, I believe, my moral compass is telling me this is what's best for my country. And so I'm going to stand up and speak for it. And he also was the first president that addressed the NAACP. And then, of course, Lyndon Johnson, which many of you know about. Lyndon Johnson pushed through Congress in 1964, the Civil Rights Act. This was a legislation that had been born under President Kennedy, and Johnson really effectively used the legacy of the slain president of Kennedy to get momentum through Congress that he might not have otherwise been able to get the Civil Rights Act passed. But then he went even one step further. Oh, and I should real quick, let me mention, for those of you that are not as familiar, what Civil Rights Act of 1964 did. It prohibited discrimination in public places. It forced the integration not only of public schools, right, which the Supreme Court had ruled on back in 1954, but it also mandated the integration of public facilities, and it made employment discrimination illegal on the basis of race, sex, religion, any number of characteristics. He then pushes through in 1965 the Voting Rights Act, which for once, finally, ended a lot of the trickery in the southern states to try and still get around the 15th Amendment. So the Voting Rights Act ended poll taxes, literacy tests, the grandfather clause. If no one's familiar with the grandfather clause, that said that if someone in your family couldn't vote in 1860, right, which was at the beginning of the Civil War when slavery was still legal, then you could not vote. right? That's how some states did it. And so he pushed through the Voting Rights Act, which greatly increased the franchise, the number of people that could participate in their civil right to vote. And then the last one that I listed on here is President Obama, because I think he's going to go down in history as, up until his time, doing the most to push for anti-discrimination in terms of the LGBTQ community. In case you are not familiar with some of what Obama did, he expanded hate crime laws, he ended racial profiling, he supported ex-offenders' re-entry into society, he eliminated sentencing disparities, he expanded drug courts as alternatives to incarceration. He came out and personally endorsed marriage equality in May of 2012, and he refused to defend the Defense of Marriage Act, which had been passed under Bill Clinton. And he lifted the ban, he ended don't ask, don't tell in the military, saying that that people should not have to hide their sexual identity in order to serve in the military. And he even lifted the ban on transgender people serving in the military. And again, it didn't go as far as some people say he should have or could have, but I think history is going to look at the progress that he made and the way he really built on the way that Bill Clinton had at least gotten anti-discrimination in terms of gay and lesbian rights to become part of the broader civil rights discussion. Obama really put more of that into action in law, or pushed for it to become part of law, than any president before him. And there's more examples, but these are just some to kind of get your brain juices flowing, some examples to think about. I tried to kind of span history. I tried to be even with 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats up there. You know, I think in terms of where we are today, I think that if history is looking familiar to any time in the past, I would say that, and this is just the view of one historian, that it's looking, I think, out of any kind of span, any president's term, more similar to that of Woodrow Wilson from 1913 to 1921 than any other time period that comes to mind for me. So why? Why do I think that? Well, during this time period, you had a rise of nativism. You had this real growing fear among the American populace that a lot of politicians played on, this fear of the other, whether the other is the immigrant, mostly from Southern Europe at this time. So they were Catholic, they had darker skin, or they might even be Slavic in background. You had fear of Jewish immigration. You had fear of immigration from Asia and from Mexico and farther south in Latin America. You have The Birth of a Nation, that movie that comes out in 1915 that really brings the Klan as the rescuers of the lost cause. And you see that same year a rebirth of the Klan with a new chapter established by, I think his first name was William, I know his last name is Simmons, in Atlanta, Georgia. And by 1924, you have chapters of the Klan in all 48 states that were part of the United States at that time. You see anti-immigration in terms of the Immigration Act of 1917, which is when we introduced literacy tests. Chinese immigration had already been banned back in the 1880s, but this Immigration Act in 1917 basically eliminates immigration from many other countries in Asia. You have the Palmer raids, so named for the Attorney General at the time. These are raids oftentimes without warrants of immigrant communities, supposedly to round up anarchists. This was after a series of bombings that were blamed on anarchists, oftentimes with little or no evidence. But many immigrants were caught up in these raids simply because they were in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time, or that's where they lived. And they were in mass numbers put in jail, and many of them deported without trials. And at the same time, you saw a growing isolationism. You saw many people in America that were talking about the fact that the United States needed to take care of Americans first. And we needed to worry less about the rest of the world and take care of America. And Wilson would have to really go up against this isolationism as he starts to believe that we need to enter World War I in the name of fighting for democracy in the future and democracy around the world. And because he's really pushing against public will when he's trying to get the United States to enter World War I, one of the interesting things he does is he creates the Federal Committee on Public Information, often referred to as the Creel Committee, named for the gentleman Creel, who was the journalist put as its chairman. But the Creel Committee was basically tax-payered government propaganda. So basically telling the United States with their own taxpayer money that you needed to be patriotic. Here's what being patriotic looked like. Here's who the enemy is. Here's who you should be afraid of. Here's why you should support the war. He also passed, and Congress gave him, the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918, which really, really limited free speech, particularly any criticism of the government, any attempt to keep people from being drafted or showing up for the draft or enrolling in the draft. And these acts were used against hundreds of people in the United States, including famously Eugene Debs, the socialist labor organizer, who was found guilty of speaking out against the government and sentenced to 10 years in prison under these acts. And then, of course, you saw a worldwide pandemic. I hate calling it the Spanish flu because it didn't start in Spain. The poor Spanish have gotten blamed for it. Many historians and scientists think that it started in Kansas here in the United States, but it's known as the Spanish flu or the Spanish influenza. And it's going to end up taking 600,000 American lives and over 20 million lives globally. And part of the reason why it took so many lives is because those who knew about the pandemic saw it spreading, particularly on military bases there in Kansas and then in other parts of the United States, did not speak up because of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. They thought that they would be held accountable for their words and possibly tried for speaking out against the war effort or trying to undermine the war effort or support for it by going public with what they believed was actually happening with the pandemic. So the government was quiet about the pandemic. It didn't tell the people everything that it knew. And because of the atmosphere it created, many scientists and doctors didn't even feel like they could speak up. So it's not the same time period. We're not in World War I, and God forbid we go to war anytime soon. But I hope that you can see some similarities. And there were definitely a number of opportunities here for Woodrow Wilson, a president who called himself a progressive, considered himself a progressive, was a political scientist by training, to take action and kind of push the envelope, and he did not. So I think that when presidents like Wilson don't act on these fronts, it's not all for nothing. I would say that this is my kind of hopeful part of my presentation. And the positive takeaway for myself doing my own research is that when I put up this slide before about the patterns of presidential leadership, what was missing was what's at the bottom. When there's one of these critical flashpoint moments and the public becomes more focused on it, and a president is faced with a question of, am I going to act? Am I not going to act? What does my conscience tell me? What does the political atmosphere tell me? if they don't act, it's not that nothing happens, because we've seen time and again that those grassroots advocates, they don't give up just because the president didn't act. Oftentimes, they become better organized and they can fundraise more easily because there's now media coverage of what they've been talking about. There's sustained political attention because the political ear now is like listening for this. In many cases, they look to the courts and they start to be able to see, because of more fundraising and more people coming in to their grassroots advocacy ranks, they're able to push their case through winning court cases. And so as they become more organized in advocacy, we see they sustain that advocacy and grow it until there's another critical flashpoint and we get somebody else in office who has to look at their conscience and look at the political landscape. And maybe they do things differently and they actually decide to act when it's their turn. So I want to leave you with a quote, the same way that I put one up in the beginning, that I think is kind of hopeful. And that's from Franklin Roosevelt. He didn't make my list of those who acted on civil rights, but he is famous. This is actually from a speech that he never gave. He passed away at his cottage in Warm Springs, Arkansas in the spring of 1955, shortly after re-election for his fourth term as president. And he was found in his cottage. That's where he passed away. And on the deck was a speech that he had drafted that he was supposed to give, but never did. And in that speech, he wrote these words: "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today." So if we let ourselves become too pessimistic, right, then that can project onto the future. And if we don't want that to happen, then we have to stay optimistic and we have to take positive lessons from the past and keep pushing where we think stuff needs to be pushed. So at this point, I was just going to open it up for comments, questions. I'm going to be done talking. So you can type them in the chat, or you can just mute yourself and speak up. Shh. My dog is barking at me. Oh, how's Lucy? My very big dog is very well. She's not very happy not to be in the office, not to be out here right now. She loves getting on my Zoom calls. She was always known with my students. So what do you all think? Did I cover anything you didn't know before? Thought-provoking? Helpful? Discouraging?
So where do you think this goes from here? Right? I mean, there's all those parallels from 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Is this going to replay itself for the next 100? Are we going to be in 2120 doing the same thing? Or at some point, does it change?
I don't think so. And I think one of the other positive things that we see on a lot of civil rights fronts is how the time between when we first get change and then we get more change on that same front and more change, that time becomes shorter and shorter and shorter.
Is that generational?
Not even generational, but if you think about it, some women wanted at least like the rights to own property, to keep property in their own name if their husband passed away. Back from like the founding of the country, they wanted the right to be able to divorce a husband that beat them. And they didn't get that back in the late 1700s. They were talking about equal rights for women and even the right to vote in the mid 1800s. Didn't happen then. They get the right to vote finally, right, in 1920. But between that and then what we saw happen with feminism in the 1970s was like 50 years, right? Or 30 years. It was like a tiny portion of the time it had taken for women up until then. And then we saw just gangbusters of breakthroughs for women, right? After they got the right to vote. When you talk about changes in the late 1960s, in the course of like 10 years, abortion became legalized. They got all kinds of legal reforms passed, including making rape a felony, because it hadn't been. They got, they almost got the ERA. They didn't, but they had multiple presidents even, and many legislators on both sides of the aisle in Congress supporting an equal rights amendment. And so that was great change that took a lot shorter period after the first significant change of getting them the right to vote. And I think we're seeing that again. I mean, look at how long after you got the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment after the Civil War, right, which was supposed to make all of the former slaves now free, protected equally under the law, make them citizens, give them the right to vote. Well, we know all those things didn't happen. And it took all the way until the mid-1960s to get significant change, right? But once we got that, we're getting it again. And we're going to get it more quickly, I think. I think once the ball gets rolling, it's easier to keep it rolling, even if it kind of momentum slows down for periods. That makes sense.
That's kind of my point. It's like come 1865, the Civil War ends and the former slaves get the right to vote, but the women don't.
Right.
And it's not until another 60 years before the women get the right to vote. And then another 60 years before they get to have their own autonomy. And now we're going right back to where we were. I mean, is it?
And that's why I don't think so. I think that sometimes the momentum can be frustrating depending on what side you're on. But I think that on both sides, it's a little bit forward, a little bit back, a little bit forward, a little bit back. Whether on any issue, what side you're on, that's kind of how we seem to move as a country. And like it or not, that's what the founding fathers thought democracy should be. It was supposed to be messy. It wasn't supposed to be easy to change the law, to change the Constitution. Because if you do things quickly, sometimes you do things rashly. And they wanted stuff to be debated and thought out. And that's why I think it's really important that if any topic is important to any section of the population, they need to keep bringing it up, right? Because if it doesn't have its moment in any given time period, it doesn't mean it's not going to have its moment, right? And they just have to keep pushing forward. So I've gotten a couple questions here that I want to make sure I answer. Clarify difference between civil rights and civil liberties.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so civil rights are considered rights that you wouldn't have if a government didn't give them to you, right? So the idea of the right to vote. We know that there was government under, say, monarchies for thousands of years where no one had the right to vote. So it's not like you're born as a human and it's like no matter where I live in the world, most humans would assume they have the right to vote. That is a right that is given to you by a government, the ability to participate. And so that's considered a civil right, right? Whereas a civil liberty is like the idea that I can tell you which candidate I support, right? That I have the freedom to talk about politics. Most of us think, and because that's one thing to criticize the government, right? It's another thing to just like say a politician's name out loud, right? Most people think that we're allowed, most humans are allowed to like say whether they vote or not, say what party they belong to, and right. So that's considered something that we have that right unless we allow the government to take it away. And so civil liberties are like the First Amendment, saying the government shall not limit, right? So those rights are preserved by keeping the government from doing something to take them away. That's really considered the difference. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Ask that question. Okay, great. The next one was, how did Woodrow Wilson get reelected given what happened during his first term?
He's handsome.
Phil, I'm live. He got reelected by a large majority of the population. Times were very uncertain, and he didn't win by a landslide by any means, but he won based on more people than not wanted him to finish things that he had started, and saw him as the more steady hand at the time, is what I would take of it, of why he won again. Of course, what's really interesting about him, in case you don't know, is that he suffered a debilitating stroke, and almost every decision that he made, anything that he read, any news that went to him or came from him went through his wife, because almost nobody saw him. He was literally bedridden in the White House. And so things from Congress would come to her, and she would decide what needed to the secretaries actually needed to read to him, what needed to be discussed with him, and then his word would be taken back to the American people or to Congress. Pretty interesting. And so, you kind of have to wonder, would he have acted differently if he had been fully able to, right? Like he didn't do anything about the Palmer raids. Would he have if he hadn't been debilitated by a stroke? Maybe, just to be fair to him. Let's see, anything else? Let's see. Seems like, there's always a reactionary period after some progress made. Reconstruction, then Jim Crow. Do you think we are in a reactionary time or truly going to see lasting change? I am very hopeful that we are going to see lasting change. And here's one example why. For the last, I think I've been teaching for 5 years now, my survey of American history. And for one of my writing assignments, I have had my students, right after we study the first removals of Indian tribes through the Trail of Tears under Andrew Jackson. So we're still like 1820s at this point, 1830s. Right after we study those removals, I have my students read a couple of documents that talk about life on reservations today, statistics from the 2010 census in terms of the level of education, life expectancy, diseases, unemployment, things like that. And then I have them write an essay. They have to take a stand one way or the other. Should the federal government step in and force all schools and sports teams at any level, from professional all the way down, to get rid of any mascots or logos that depict Native Americans? I can't have them write that essay anymore because it's happened, right? And not the federal government, political pressure. The Redskins, every single one of my students would write about the Redskins. There's been a lot of literature in Sports Illustrated, in the Washington Post over the years about whether or not the Washington Redskins should be forced to change their name. Redskin is a very derogatory term, very derogatory towards Native Americans, dating back to the 1800s. And that's happened. So because of changes like that, I don't think we're in a reactionary time. I had my students read articles after reading about Reconstruction about the Confederate statues and the debate over the Confederate statues. How many of them have come down? Or are local governments and state governments, seriously debating whether they should remain, if they should remain on state property, right? If they're going to be moved, where should they be moved to? Is it a matter of taking them down, or do we need to put up more statues, right, to celebrate the enslaved people, to celebrate the efforts on the other side, right? How do we handle this? But again, I've had my students writing about it for 5 years, and it's happening. It's like, it is everyday political discussion, and we're taking action on it. So we're in a somewhat, I think, reactionary time, but I'm myself a progressive. For me, it's hard to read a lot of the history I read because I'm a political historian and not be progressive, because I just read a lot of our history in the past, and I say, I can see how in the context of that time, it seemed like the right thing to do but that's not my time now. And so I'm not totally pessimistic by any means. But I'm sure there's people pushing for a lot more change than even, a me. So, do you have a hotline we can call for when we feel a lot less than optimistic? My friend, you know where to reach me. Call me anytime. If nobody else has anything else, I will just say thank you so much. It's just a joy and a pleasure for me to talk about, what fascinates me, what I find more interesting than fiction, and to see so many friendly faces from over the years. So thank you very much. I think somebody from the Lair will jump back in now.
No, good. That's it. Thank you, Kathleen. That was awesome. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate all the 8th weekers. And I think there were some people from other weeks as well. And we'll be here again next week with Jim Knowlton, the athletic director at Cal. So join us then. And again, thank you, Kathleen, very, very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight.
You're welcome. Go
And
Bears.
go Bears.